Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson, and I'm so happy to be with Bob Frank. Hello, Bob.
Hi, David.
And we're thinking of doing some podcasts together on evolutionary economics. And we're beginning with a conversation with each other. We think it's going to be a lot of fun to interview other people together because Robert, of course, brings the economics into it, and I bring the evolution into it. And but we want to start by telling our own stories as to how we became evolutionary economists, starting from different directions. So, Bob, why don't you begin with your own story, and then I'll follow with mine.
Well, long before I even got interested in economics or even knew that there was such a thing as economics, I think I had the natural temperament of a field biologist. I think of that as someone who looks around and tries to make sense of what he sees out there. And I took a course in the 10th grade. The instructor was a man by the name of Caspar Wirtz. And he was really the best teacher I think I'd ever had up until that time. It was a basic biology course, and it was just for me a thrill to see how just a few simple biological principles suddenly brought so many things together when you're walking around. You know, why certain trees are different from others, the strategies they use, the different shapes that animals take, and all of that, which was just noise before, suddenly started to make sense. So I was always interested in biology very keenly from that course on. I became an economist, I think, largely because that's what Peace Corps volunteers did after serving in the Peace Corps.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that economists were all Peace Corps members.
Well, I think it was very common, at least in our group, for people to want to go back and study development economics. I mean, most of us were in poor countries, and trying to figure out what to do about abject poverty seemed like an urgent thing to focus on. And so I applied to be a development economist. I was accepted at a few places, went to Berkeley because that's where the offer was the most generous, and discovered early on that they didn't have any really good program in development economics. So I started studying just other areas in economics, and went on, took a job at Cornell straight out of Berkeley. And I think in the course of puzzling about economic things, I was gradually led to focus back on the biology that I thought about so hard as a 10th grader. I think one of the first problems I puzzled over was when I was on my first sabbatical. I was in Washington, D.C., and I had bought a townhouse that I was busily renovating, and I had some guys who were working for me, and I noticed that they would come in the morning. They would have brand new vans with stereos and bars in them and carpeted walls, really very fancy vans. Then they would come up into the apartment and set up to work. And the way they would work on the ceiling was to set 3 stack high 5-gallon sheetrock compound buckets, and then put a 2x10 in between the 2 stacks. Then they'd somehow climb up on top of that and work on the ceiling. And from time to time, it would collapse in a heap, and they'd get hurt, usually not too badly. And I asked them, why don't you guys get some real scaffolding? That would be so much safer and better to work on. And they said that it takes too long to set up scaffolding. You got to move it, and that takes time too. And if they took all that extra time, they wouldn't be able to meet the payments on their vans. And so that just struck me as so odd. Why is it that having a brand new van with all those trimmings, and all the contractors who were doing work on our block had the same ones? They were. It was evidently a very keen competition among them to see who could have the nicest one. And it just seemed to me, thinking about it, that if somebody could wave a magic wand and have all of them drive a 5-year-old van rather than a brand new one, and use the money they'd saved by having lower payments each month to buy some scaffolding, overall they'd be better off. It was really the comparison between their vans and the other vans that was really driving their behavior. So I began after that to see all sorts of parallels between that pattern of behavior and patterns of behavior in the animal kingdom, and it's just been a long ride ever since then, thinking about the kinds of arms races that we see both in the animal kingdom and in nature and in the natural economy.
Right. So that's the hallmark of your work, of course. All the way back to 1988, I think, is when you first appeared on my radar screen and my colleagues with your book, Passions Within Reason. And ever since, you've been developing this theme of, as I put it, the concept of relative utilities rather than absolute utilities as one difference between evolutionary economics and standard economics. Is that about right?
Yes, and it's to this day a major intellectual puzzle for me. Why is it that economists haven't been quicker to embrace the idea that it's relative amounts that really matter most in life? You know, Darwin's key insight from a certain perspective was that life is graded on the curve. You know, it really doesn't matter how big you are, how strong you are, how smart you are, how fast you are. None of that matters. What counts is how those qualities compare with the individuals you're competing directly against. So if you're smarter than they are, even if you're both dumb, you're more likely to get through into the next round than they are. And so it had to be true if the brain was forged by natural selection. Does anyone have a competing theory? I haven't heard it. If they do, not a competing scientific theory anyway. And so if the brain was forged by natural selection, and we can imagine two variants, one that follows the standard economic model, they care only about absolute amounts that they have. The other cares about relative magnitudes. I'm going to put my money on the one that cares about relative magnitudes. That individual is going to be way more likely to achieve high rank, local rank, and way more likely, therefore, to pass his or her stuff on into the next round.
Yeah. Well, my story begins with a boy when you started in the 10th grade. So in the 10th grade, I was always loved nature, being out in nature. So that made it natural for me to become a biologist and an evolutionary biologist who made a specialty out of the study of social behavior, including the evolution of altruism and cooperation and all that. Those are economic subjects. But I basically remained within evolutionary biology until I started the Evolution Institute in 2007. And now I was interested in applying evolution to human real-world problems. And at the very beginning, in 2008, one of our major benefactors during the financial crisis, he said, basically, hey, David, what can evolution say about this? And over a weekend, I wrote a proposal to the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center to hold a conference, which I called The Nature of Regulation, How Evolution Can Inform the Regulation of Large-Scale Human Society. And danged if I didn't get it. So now I had the resources to basically to organize a major conference on this topic, and I knew nothing about economics at that point. In fact, economics mystified me, and as with almost everyone else, it seemed like the most forbidding of all topics. You know, it was heavily mathematical, and that's not a problem with me. I'm a theoretical biologist, but you know, economists got Nobel Prizes as if, you know, their accomplishments were like discovering DNA and exactly the jargon and the models and so on. Despite the fact that they were mathematical, they mystified me. But luckily, I had the opportunity to learn from the best since I was inviting them to the conference. One of my first teachers was Eric Beinhocker in his book, The Origin of Wealth, which was a beautiful summary of economic history and the need to base economics on evolution and complexity. And so over the years, starting with that conference, I also got funded by Nescent to to hold 4 workshops over a period of 2 years. Then most recently, I was able to work with the Ernst Strungman Forum in Germany to organize another major conference, which just took place last year. I've now published numerous articles, edited special issue. I now feel quite comfortable, basically, critiquing economic theory, and it's really an amazing story to me how what's currently known as orthodox economics got started in the 19th century, how it was inspired by Newtonian physics, and so it aspired to a certain mathematical description of nature. The goal was to create a physics of social behavior, and how that aspiration has been tremendously constraining, forced such simplifying assumptions both onto the conception of human nature and the social environment, that it was like a hopeless starting point, is the way that I put it. If you were to build a foundation for economics, it would not be based on the conception of Newtonian physics. You cannot have a complete mathematical description of the world. That's not the way theory goes at all. And so if anything deserves to be called paradigmatic, and the need for paradigmatic change, I think it is the switch from the foundation of orthodox economics to a new foundation based on both evolution and complexity. Evolution's needed to explain the nature of human preferences and abilities, and complexity is required to explain large-scale economic systems that are often out of equilibrium. And as an example of how you cannot get there from here, or here from there, of why orthodox economic theory has been unable to change itself, that comparison between absolute and relative fitness, I think, provides one of the best examples. We can understand why the initial assumption was absolute fitness, and for one thing, it makes the math simpler. But why there wasn't a convergence, why there wasn't movement, a realization that life is graded on a curve, basically is a testimony to the incapacity for change in orthodox economic theory. So I'm an outsider. I'm happy to be tempered by an insider like you or not. But this is what I want to bring to our conversations with other people when we start talking with other people.
Yeah, that's an interesting account. My quick observation is that I don't think the math was the stumbling block into getting the ideas clearly formulated at the outset. You know, the economists like math, as you pointed out. If it's more complicated, that's seen as an advantage, not a disadvantage. If you're looking at a pair of economists competing for the same job, almost every economist today will tell you candidly that the one who's perceived to be the more rigorous of the pair has the inside track on getting the job. And so while in science we're taught to look for the simplest explanations, the nature of competition for jobs in economics doesn't really push people in that direction. The impulse is more often for economists to say, isn't there some way to make this more complicated? And as you point out, the math gets a little bit more complicated when you say that people care not only how big is my house in absolute terms, but also how does it compare with other houses in the area. That does add a layer of complexity, granted. But why don't they see that as an advantage rather than a disadvantage? So I don't think that can be the explanation for what in a century's time I predict will be seen as a puzzlingly stubborn refusal to change the profession's view of what people's goals are. They've got a basic model that just doesn't fit reality as we observe it, and they've been very, very stubborn about movement in other directions with it.
Yeah, well, let's spend a few more minutes on this. I want to make 2 major points. One is, we covered this a little bit in our interview, which available. But all subjects, including physics and biology, hit what I like to call a complexity wall as they become more realistic. And what the complexity wall forces you to do is to go beyond formal analytical models and to begin to include such things as computer simulations, agent-based models, and this sort of thing. In addition, every science worthy of the name is a dialectic between models and empirical research. Any model, no matter how simple or complex, is basically going to depart from reality unless it's anchored by being related to empirical research. So unless there is a back and forth between model building and empirical testing, then you don't even deserve to call yourself a science. And I think that in the great book Chaos by James Gleick, which was on the birth of complexity science, he shows how the theorists of the time were so wedded to analytical models that they basically defined complex interactions out of existence. They simply didn't study it because they didn't have the toolkit to do so. And they looked down upon those who did. And so I think that's part of the dynamics in economics, is that we have people that are wedded to a certain kind of formal analytical modeling. They hit the complexity wall, and they don't want to go beyond it because it involves different toolkit that they look down upon. So I think that basically economics is recapitulating what took place in physics and other studies of complex interactions. About several decades after the fact. But the second point I want to make, would you like to comment on that point before I make my?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely spot-on description of what happens in lots of different disciplines. In economics, it was certainly true that the agent-based models and the complex simulations were considered lowbrow. The people who had formal analytic models that could be solved explicitly, they got the good jobs. The others competed at the fringes. That's begun to change now, but you're absolutely right that was an important part of the dynamic for a long time. Where that still strikes me as less than a complete explanation for what's puzzling both of us is that you don't come anywhere near the complexity wall simply by inserting a concern about relative position into the basic analytical models. They're simple one or two equation models. You get most of the main results. You get the explanation for why construction workers might pile sheetrock cans on top of each other rather than building scaffolds, just from the simplest of those models. And so what's going on there? Why are people so resistant? And especially, I think, since economists have embraced another apparent input from biology in their thinking about preferences. The standard economic model rests on the assumption of people being self-interested in the narrowest sense of that term. And I think most economists think of Darwin as the inspiration for that assumption. Yes, it would be great if everyone were altruistic and set her own interests aside in the name of promoting the common good. But since individuals can do better on their own if they don't do that, we need to expect narrowly selfish behavior. That's not, in fact, what we see much of the time, as you and I both have written about. But I think Darwin has been the inspiration for clinging to that assumption, which is also not descriptive. So if they like Darwin there, why don't they like Darwin's assumption that life is graded on the curve? I think we're still grappling for an answer to that question.
Yeah, okay. And the point about selfishness, that's certainly how Darwin was rendered. That's, social Darwinism is rendered that way. Not true of Darwin the man, as you know.
No, of course.
Who very much, he was the first person to think about group selection and all that. This does kind of segue into the second point that I wanted to make, which is that behind the entire history of economics, from the beginning to the present, is the concept of laissez faire. The whole question as to whether economies and societies can run themselves basically on the basis of individuals just doing what they want to do, and that being steered as if by an invisible hand for the good of society. So the role of the state, the need for the state not to get too much involved, and so on and so forth, has been like the elephant in the room from the very beginning. At the very beginning, the state was like, monarchy. So something which definitely was inhibiting markets and so on and so forth. But nowadays, we fast forward, then that's what it's all about. And it's what it seems to be what it's all about at the level of high theory and what it's about at the level of vulgar narrative with market fundamentalism and all that. So that seems to be like, and always has been the issue in some sense. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think we just can't understand why the state does what it does using the standard economic model to think about that. If people are self-interested and if their happiness depends only on their absolute payoffs, then it's easy to see why many economists would believe that if the state tries to prevent people from doing what they want to do, it could actually make matters worse. But once you admit into the conversation that what I want to do and what you want to do may not add up to what we want to happen, that line of thinking just dissolves completely. So there's so many examples from everyday life in which that's clear as an illustration. You think about people who stand to see better at a sporting event. None of them see any better when they all stand than if they'd all remain comfortably seated. That doesn't mean anybody was coercing them to stand. It doesn't mean they were irrational or short-sighted, any of the usual explanations for why some economists admit we could use some regulation. None of those factors are in play. It's just that what it pays me to do as an individual is not in our interests that we all do. If we all stand, we don't any of us see better, and yet we're all less comfortable. So acknowledging that life's graded on the curve opens the door to a vast array of possibilities in which we might want to put limits on what we ourselves allow ourselves to do. We don't save enough. That's true in every society. The only way people can save as much as they need to maintain their standard of living in retirement, apparently, is for government to intervene and set money aside on their behalf. Why is that? Well, it's because if you have the money at your disposal, you'll be forced to spend it in the bidding war for a house in a better school district. And when we all do that, we just drive up the prices of the houses in the good school districts, and still half of all kids go to bottom half schools the same as before. So, yeah, the whole vision of what the state is about is transformed completely by admitting Darwin's central assumption that life's graded on the curve.
Well, from my perspective, when you think about the concept of regulation as a biologist, then it's completely different than the whole economic discourse. The number of regulatory systems that are required to keep you and me alive is mind-boggling. There's hundreds and thousands of them, all integrated with each other, and they all evolved by a process of natural selection at the individual level. Something like that is needed for society. The concept of society as an organism, I think, is a metaphor that really provides the alternative to the orthodox economics, as we've talked a little about in the past, and I look forward to doing so more so. But what that means is that there's lots of bad regulations. Regulations are like mutations. For every one that's good, there's 100 that are bad. So it's not as if there's the wrong kind of regulation. There's everywhere. But it's a matter of finding the right regulation, not no regulations. An unregulated organism is a dead organism. So these are all things that make such obvious sense, so elementary from an evolutionary perspective, and yet so absent from orthodox economic thinking that I'm so happy to be pairing up with you basically to explore them with others. And I think the first person we're going to interview is Dick Nelson, if I'm not mistaken, one of the fathers of evolutionary economics. That will be fun. And
Yeah, so looking forward to that conversation.
yeah, and then we'll see who else we want to interview together. But this is a nice way to start with a conversation between the two of us.
It's been fun.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right.